Bibles tonight. Good to have everybody here. Good to have visitors here from out of town. Appreciate everyone making their way out to evening church service. The book of Job tonight. So we have crossed an imaginary line, if you will, in our series through the Bible. That's what we're doing for our visitors. On Sunday nights, we are going through a series through the Bible, cover to cover through the Bible in about a year and a half. We'll see how long it takes us exactly, but pretty much every service we try to preach an entire book of the Bible. So we started in Genesis and one or two services apiece, and we are now to the book of Job. But with the line we have crossed into a new section of Scripture. Okay, the Bible, as we have it today, is not lined out chronologically, linearly as it happened. The first books of the Bible were given as the law, and they have a lot of history built into them. The books that follow Deuteronomy, so Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, we'll see if I can get these, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, those are historical books. So we have now covered the entire chronological timeline of the Old Testament. The timeline is done when you get to the books of Esther and Nehemiah, and everything that follows in the Old Testament fits in and overlaps with some of these others. Okay? Matter of fact, the book of Job, some people believe, could be the oldest book in human history. You say, well, what about Genesis? Well, the events of Genesis obviously happened first, but the writing of it, the recording of it, did not come about until Moses, which was about 1400 BC. So it could very well be that what happened and transpired and what was written down regarding this man named Job took place during the events that were taking place around the Tower of Babel and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And so it was during that patriarchal period probably. And so we could very well be looking at the oldest book in the Bible. And it begins a section of Scripture known as poetry, Hebrew poetry. A lot of times we think of a poem as something that rhymes. Roses are red, violets are blue. You know, you finish it. There's 1,000 different ways to finish it, right? And it rhymes, and there's meter to it, and so on. Well, the Bible, in Hebrew poetry, they don't necessarily have parallel sounds, as in rhyming, and they don't necessarily have parallel meter in their poetry. They have parallel truths, and it reflects upon itself, and it builds upon itself. And so we'll get a feel for it as we get into some of this, but this is definitely a poem. An epic that was written down about a man named Job in a land of Uz. It's a real place, but we're foggy historically where it was or exactly when it was. It probably was intended to be vague so that it's just applicable to everyone, everywhere, who may be struggling to understand the ways of God. Let's just begin by reading a portion of chapter 1. I think it's a familiar story to you, but that'll get us going here tonight. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels, and 500 yoke of oxen and 500 she-asses, a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the east. And his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. And it was so when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned, and cursed God in their hearts. Thus did Job continually. So he's leading his family spiritually. He's offering sacrifices on their behalf. Verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God, a.k.a. angels, the angels, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth. and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made an hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power, only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. And so the rest of the story continues on with the worst day any man has ever imagined. His sons and daughters get together for a party, a get-together in their house, in the eldest one's home, and a tornado comes. And the house collapses and kills all of them. Natural disasters take place, and some of his livestock is killed and burnt alive by lightning and fire falling from heaven. Some thieves, some bandits roving through the land come, and they steal the rest of his livestock and slay all of his servants. I mean, Job, by the end of this day, is desolate. The greatest man in the East now has nothing. In one day, it is all taken away from him. And Satan had challenged God and said, if you would take that protection off of all his stuff, he'll curse you to your face. Well, let's see what he does. Verse 20. Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped and said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. The next chapter says that he goes after Job's health itself, and Job is covered from head to foot with these boils and this scourge and this plague, and his wife even turns against him, against God, and she just says, just curse God and die. Just be done, Job. God obviously hates us. So let's just be done with the whole thing. And then some friends show up. 3 friends. And they come and they just sit with him for a while. And they're trying to be a comfort to him. They're looking for the words to say. And so for 7 days, they just spend time with him. And they don't start talking. But then they start talking, and the poem of Job begins in chapter 3. His conversation ensues with, Job is the one that speaks. He's the one that opens his mouth. It says he cursed his day, and Job spake and said, Let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, There is a man-child conceived. He wishes he had never been born. That's how bad of the pain is that he is going through. That he says, you know what, it would have just been better if I would have just died in the womb and I would have never come into this awful, awful world. And when Job starts talking about woe is me and all the pain that he is going through, which I don't want to minimize, he was going through some serious suffering at this point, greater than any one of us can fully imagine. And then his friends begin to give their advice and their take on what is happening. They go in 3 rounds, basically, of conversation. One man will speak, Job responds. The next man speaks, Job responds. Third man speaks, Job responds. Okay? That's how the book goes. And then they start a round 2. The first guy speaks, Job responds. You get the picture? It's 3 triads of literature here. And then it is structured in poetry fashion. And there's a conversation back and forth between Job and his friends. And the discussion is related to the mystery of suffering. The big question is, why do people suffer? Why do righteous people suffer? I mean, Job is going through this awful, awful situation, and he's wondering why. He would love to just have a reason. Just anything. I mean, if it's some sin that I committed way back when, I just want to know what this is for. Why has God decided to so put me through this turmoil? But he says, it's not that. I know that I am innocent in all this. he doesn't claim to be sinless. Nobody's perfect. Nobody is without any kind of sin at all. But Job is saying, the level of desolation that has come into my life, it's not fitting with the sins that I've committed. It feels like God is unjust to me. Why am I suffering? Why do the godly suffer? And so his friends take turns chiming in on the discussion. But they don't want to discuss why a man who is godly suffers, because they don't believe that that's how God works. So they put forth their theory throughout this debate that suffering is always the result of sin. That's their argument. That anytime a person goes through a calamity, a tragedy like this, it's because it's a punishment for some sin that they have committed. God's punishing you, Job. The first one to speak up, and I'm going to kind of outline these guys and what their basic philosophies were as they're giving this to Job. Of course, we're just doing overview in all of this. We're not going to get into the depths of it. But the first guy to speak is, I guess, the oldest one, supposedly the wisest. His name is Eliphaz the Temanite. This is chapter 4. He begins to speak. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, "If we essay to commune with thee, wilt thou be grieved? But who can withhold himself from speaking? Behold, thou hast instructed many, and thou hast strengthened the weak hands." So he's kind of commending him, kind of praising him for the good that he has done. But then he says this in verse 7, "Remember, I pray thee, whoever perished being innocent? Or where were the righteous cut off?" Job, have you ever seen somebody who was righteous and innocent cut off like this before? Has that ever happened? Have you ever seen a good man go through what you're going through? Job, our experience tells us it doesn't work that way. Good people don't suffer like this. And essentially his argument is based upon his experience. Several times he says, I have seen. Look at verse 7, or verse 8. "Even as I have seen, they that plow iniquity and sow wickedness reap the same." Job, you're reaping a harvest that you sowed back here somewhere. Somewhere you did wrong and you did wickedly, and now you're reaping the consequences of it. Chapter 5, verse 3, he says, "I have seen the foolish taking root, but suddenly I cursed his habitation." So he says, I've seen this. I've seen people play the circumstances play out over and over and over again. And verse 27 says, "Lo, this, we have searched it, so it is. Hear it and know it for thy good." So he believes that suffering is always the direct outcome of sin. It is God's judgment. God is correcting Job. And so in order to get out of the suffering that you're going through, Job, you've got to confess your sin and you've got to get it right with God if you ever hope to get out of this suffering that you are experiencing right now. Verse 17, he says, "Behold, happy is the man whom God correcteth. Therefore despise not thou the chastening of the Almighty, for he maketh sore and bindeth up. He woundeth, and his hands make whole." He makes, Job responds. They go through the first triad. He makes a second speech in chapter 15. Skip over there. Chapter 15 and verse 14 says, "What is man that he should be clean? And he which is born of a woman that he should be righteous? Behold, he putteth no trust in his saints. Yea, the heavens are not clean in his sight. How much more abominable and filthy is man, which drinketh iniquity like water? I will show thee. Hear me. And that which I have seen, I will declare." Again, he's basing this off of experience. Here's how I've seen it work, Job. People sin, and then they reap the consequences, and they face the punishment for their sin, because God is just and man is wicked, and so all suffering is a result of your sin. And Job says, no, I don't believe it. I don't believe that what I am going through right now could be the direct result of some sin that I have done in my life. And so in the third speech, in the third go-around, chapter 22, Eliphaz comes right out and accuses Job he starts suggesting specific sins that never even happened. He says, here's what you probably did, Job. Look at chapter 22, verse 5. Is not thy wickedness great, and thine iniquities infinite? For thou hast taken a pledge from thy brother for naught, and stripped the naked of their clothing. Thou hast not given water to the weary to drink. Thou hast withholden bread from the hungry. Verse 9. Thou hast sent widows away empty, and the arms of the fatherless have been broken. Therefore snares are round about thee, and sudden fear troubleth thee. He's just making stuff up now. That Job, you're a hypocrite. You're hiding your sin. You need to get right with God. Verse 21, acquaint now thyself with him, and be at peace. Thereby good shall come unto thee. So you kind of get Eliphaz's point of view. The next to speak is named Bildad, the Shuhite. Great names, by the way. Bildad essentially has the same theory, but instead of personal experience, he bases it upon the ancient words of wisdom, of wise men. So there, in our society, it would be like going back to quote Ben Franklin, and the almanac and Poor Richard's almanac and some of those wise sayings that people said way back when. That's what he's doing, and he stitches together all these proverbs and stuff. Go back to chapter 8. This is where Bildad starts. Verse 8. He says, for inquire, I pray thee, of the former age, and prepare thyself to the search of their fathers, for we are but of yesterday, and know nothing, because our days are upon the earth are a shadow. Shall not they teach thee, and tell thee, and utter words out of their heart? So he points to tradition, and he basically says the same thing, even to the point of saying, Job, you know why your children died, right? I mean, this is a guy that just lost his kids, his whole family. He says, Job, let's be honest, we all know why they died. They were wicked. It's like you don't say this to somebody, Look back at verse 3. Doth God pervert judgment? Or doth the Almighty pervert justice? If thy children have sinned against him, and he have cast them away for their transgression. That's what happened, Job. And he doesn't really even put forth a new theory or a new argument or any kind of reason. He just stitches together these proverbs that may or may not have any ramification on what the discussion is actually about. Look at a couple of these. Verse 11. Can the rush grow up without mire? Can the flag grow without water? Whilst it is in its greenness and not cut down, it withereth before any other herb. I want to say, what are you even talking about? And I'm sure there's wisdom to it. There's some sort of proverb that can be gained, and maybe the others were going, ooh, he's quoting from the ancients here, and he's pulling out the big dogs here. Verse 14, whose hope shall be cut off, and whose trust shall be a spider's web. He shall lean upon his house, and it shall not stand. He shall hold it fast, but it shall not endure. He is green before the sun, and his branch shooteth forth in his garden. His roots are wrapped about the heap, and seeth the place of stones. I'm sure it sounded real wise, but it wasn't very helpful. He's just pointing back to tradition. Here's what these people say. This must be wisdom. He says he does the same thing in chapter 18. We won't belabor it. And then chapter 24. Turn over to chapter 24. Job basically, he starts talking about, I see a hole in your argument, guys. You say that the wicked get punished and the righteous get rewarded. That's your sense of God's justice. But there's another aspect to all of this. We all know wicked people that aren't suffering so bad. Matter of fact, they seem to be prospering. Oh yeah, but it goes really quick. Not always. Sometimes they prosper all the way to the grave. And they pass on their fortunes to their children. And it seems like they've got it all put together and their lives are fantastic, but they're the wickedest people you can imagine. What do you say about that, guys? What does that do to your theory? Yeah. And so Bildad, he totally bypasses the question. Chapter 25 and verse 2, dominion and fear are with him, God. He maketh peace in his high places. Is there any number of his armies? And upon whom doth not his light arise? So he's saying, you know what? God is high and holy and powerful. And then he goes on and says, and man is wicked in his sight. Okay, thank you, Captain Obvious, right? We understand God is holy. We understand God is right and just and all of that. And we understand that we don't measure up to him. You didn't answer the question, Bildad. Why do the wicked flourish? And why do godly men like me suffer? Why? Bildad has nothing to answer to the question, to the discussion. His main point to Job was back in chapter 8, verse 20. He said, behold, God will not cast away a perfect man, neither will he help the evildoers. Job, you claim to be perfect, you claim to be upright. No, you're not. Job's third friend. How do you like these friends, by the way? You know, great guys, right, to have around you. Job's third friend, Zophar, the Naamathite. He has the worst argument of them all. At least Eliphaz had some years of wisdom and experience. He's like, here's what I've seen in my time. And Bildad, he's pulling out the quotes from the ancients and stuff. Zophar, his whole argument is just based on assumption. He's not going to beat around the bush. He just says it like he thinks that it is. Job, you're a sinner. And here's what he repeats. Know thou this. Here's what you need to know. Here's what you need to get figured out. I know what's going on in your life. He just assumes everything. You've sinned. You're suffering for it. Chapter 11, verse 6. And that he would show thee the secrets of wisdom, that they are double to that which is. Know therefore that God exacteth of thee less than thine iniquity deserveth. Boy, it's getting rough on Job. Not only does he say, you're reaping what you got. As bad, imagine the day that this guy has just had. He lost everything. And Zophar says, all this bad stuff that's happened to you, it's not half as bad as what you deserve. That's how wicked you are, Job. You need to get some things straight. Look at chapter 20, his next round of arguments here, Zophar. Job 20, verse 4. Knowest thou not this of old, since man was placed upon earth, that the triumphing of the wicked is short, and the joy of the hypocrite but for a moment? Verse 11. His bones are full of the sin of his youth, which shall lie down with him in the dust. Verse 27, the heaven shall reveal his iniquity, and the earth shall rise up against him. The increase of his house shall depart, and his goods shall flow away in the day of his wrath. This is the portion of a wicked man from God, and the heritage appointed unto him by God. So I'm oversimplifying their arguments. You understand that for the purposes that we have here tonight. They have interwoven some real words of wisdom. There are some thoughts that you would say, hey, that's got some validity. That's kind of true sometimes. But in their application of it to Job, in saying that it is that your suffering must be because you're wicked before God, they're wrong. And God's going to tell them that they're wrong. They're very short-sighted. They're very limited in their scope of how the infinite justice of God works. They think they've got God all figured out. You can't get God figured out. That's part of the purpose of this book. You think that you understand all the ways of God? You don't. They thought, we know what justice is, and we know that God is just, and therefore God's sense of justice must be exactly what we think our sense of justice is. That's how low of a view, how small of an angle that they think that they've got on God. And so round and round it goes, this conversation, back and forth, the friends insisting Job is suffering for his sin. Job continuing to say, no, this is not the result of some hidden sin in my life. There must be another reason. And then out of nowhere comes this new voice to the conversation. We didn't even know that this guy was sitting here the whole time. This guy named Elihu. Turn to chapter 32. He's younger than the others. And he sat the whole time silent deferring, to them because their seniority and they're surely wiser than he was. So he just sat there and observed and listened. But he's frustrated at their limited viewpoints and that there seems to be no satisfactory answer yet to the suffering of Job. Look at chapter 32, verse 1. So these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu, the son of Berakal the Buzite of the kindred of Ram. Against Job was his wrath kindled because he justified himself rather than God, which, by the way, he did. There were times during the discussion where Job crossed the line, where Job went too far, where Job said, God is unjust toward me. Nah, not quite Job. You got that one mixed up too. So Elihu says, no, Job's not right. Verse 3, and also against his three friends was his wrath kindled, because they had found no answer, and yet had condemned Job. Now Elihu had waited till Job had spoken, because they were elder than he. When Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, then his wrath was kindled, and Elihu, the son of Berakal the Buzite, answered and said, I am young, and ye are very old. Wherefore I was afraid, and durst not show you mine opinion. I said, days should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom. But there is a spirit in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth them understanding. Great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment. Therefore I said, hearken to me, I also will show mine opinion. So he's tried to be respectful this whole time. He's tried to give deference to those who are older and wiser than he. And he said, you know what, I'm not hearing a lot of wisdom. And I've got a viewpoint here that none of you have brought out that I think is very valid and very possible. And I'm going to tell you my opinion on all this stuff. And to be honest with you, I like Elihu. I like him because he is respectful to Job. He does not condemn him like the others were saying, like, you're a wicked sinner. But he still calls him out where Job has impugned God's sense of justice. He tells Job that God is so great that he does not owe anyone, including you, Job, an explanation for what he is doing. Look at chapter 33, verse 12. Behold, he's talking to Job now, behold, in this thou art not just. I will answer thee, that God is greater than man. Why dost thou strive against him? For he giveth not account of any of his matters. Because Job had kept on saying, I wish that God would just answer me. I wish I would get an answer. I wish that there'd be this daysman that I could go and meet with God and plead my case and that God would give me an answer of why I'm going through this. And Elihu says, God doesn't owe you anything, Job. He's not there to give account to you or me about his ways. So he offers a new theory, a new perspective on suffering, that maybe it is not just the punishment of some past sin, but rather that through the suffering, God is seeking to teach Job something. Perhaps suffering is actually a positive thing rather than only negative. Very, very nuanced, very open-minded for someone in that era. And so he offers a couple of examples like, well, maybe God is restraining Job through suffering. He's restraining him from doing evil in the future. Maybe he's teaching him that. Look at chapter 33, verse 16. Then openeth the ears of men and sealeth their instruction, that he may withdraw man from his purpose and hide pride from man. He keepeth back his soul from the pit and his life from perishing by the sword. Job, maybe God just doesn't want you to become prideful and lifted up to the point where you do sin. Have you ever thought he's just humbling you and maybe keeping you back from some future transgression? That's a possibility. Maybe God's chastening him in order to bring out a better, more spiritually minded Job through this. Look at verse 19. He is chastened also with pain upon his bed, and the multitude of his bones with strong pain, so that his life abhorreth bread, and his soul dainty meat. So maybe God's just showing you a more spiritually disciplined way of living. And so Elihu's view of suffering, it suggests that maybe the suffering is actually intended by God to bring about a greater good, But here's the problem, Job. You're prolonging it because you're not being teachable. Your attitude through this has been awful. And because you're not submitting to what God is trying to show you through this, you're prolonging the suffering and making it worse. If you just bow down and submit yourself under God's hand of suffering here, you could end all of this. Look at chapter 36. Chapter 36. Elihu's kind of long-winded. These other guys, they go for a chapter and they're done. He goes for 6 chapters. So chapter 36, verse 15. He says about God, He delivereth the poor in his affliction, and openeth their ears in oppression. Even so would He have removed thee out of the strait into a broad place where there is no straightness. And that which should be set on thy table should be full of fatness, but thou hast fulfilled the judgment of the wicked. Judgment and justice will take hold on thee, because there is wrath. Beware lest He take thee away with His stroke, then a great ransom cannot deliver thee. So He's saying, you're making it worse, Job. You could have been delivered from this already if you'd have just submitted to it and learned the lessons that God was trying to teach you. So, Elihu does a pretty good job here, but it's not perfect. It's not perfect in its application of God, because these aren't necessarily the right answer to the question of why Job and those who are godly suffer. It offers some possible reasons, but nothing conclusive. Look at the end of chapter 37. It's almost as though Elihu is talking, and as he's talking and talking and talking, a storm is brewing. You've been outside and you see a storm coming and you hear the rumbling off in the distance, and he points to the storm and he uses it as an illustration of what he's trying to get across. Chapter 37, verse 21, and now men see not the bright light which is in the clouds, but the wind passeth and cleanseth them. Fair weather cometh out of the north. With God is terrible majesty. Touching the Almighty, we cannot find Him out. He is excellent in power and in judgment and in plenty of justice, and He will not afflict. Men do therefore fear Him. He respecteth not any that are wise of heart. And as he goes on, he's silenced by the approach of this storm. And the storm billows and it overtakes them. And then the thundering roar of a tornado comes bearing down upon them. What an unexpected twist in the poem, right? This random tornado shows up. And as if the tornado is not impressive enough, a voice then speaks out of the tornado, out of the cloud. And it is the voice of God. God is now, He has observed this entire conversation. He has been listening, He has been watching all of this, and now God is going to confront Job personally. Job, you asked to have an audience with me. Here's your chance. It's one big interrogation. It would be a terrifying moment if you were Job. Look at chapter 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare, if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? He starts talking about the creation of the world and the stars and all this stuff. And he says, Job, how big's the earth? How does it hang there upon nothing? Were you there when that was made? And of course the answer to all these is no, 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 no. And on and on and on it goes with this interrogation. Do you know this, Job? Do you know this? Do you know how to make this work? Do you know how to make that work? Do you know how to give the horse its strength and yet make it afraid as a grasshopper? Do you know how to have the ostrich as swift as it can be, but so dumb that it lays its eggs on the, I'm paraphrasing, of course, it lays its eggs right on the sand. How do you explain all of this, Job? Because nature doesn't work the way we would set it up. None of those things would work. We wouldn't make an ostrich like that. We wouldn't make a horse like that. And yet God has made all of creation fine-tuned to His ability. And the accusation is this: you're not God. You're not God, Job. You've got no clue what you're talking about. You don't know how to run this world. And all of this stuff that I'm talking about, creation and the whirlwinds and the storm and the water cycles and the function of the cosmos, is not nearly as complicated as being just and exerting justice in a wicked world. You've got no idea what you're talking about, Job. You're darkening counsel with words without knowledge. And eventually, Job comes to the end of himself. He and his friends, no doubt, their faces in the dust. Turn to chapter, well, let's sample a couple more of these if you would bear with me, just because it's such impressive dialogue here from God. Look at verse 31. Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? They had constellations back then, that they had identified. You've seen Orion and Orion's belt. Can you undo his belt, Job? I could do that. Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? These are also stars. Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof in the earth? Verse 39. Wilt thou hunt the prey for the lion, or fill the appetite of the young lions when they couch in their dens and abide in the covert to lie in wait? Who provideth for the raven his food? When his young ones cry unto God, they wander for lack of meat. Knowest thou the time when the wild goats of the rock bring forth? Or canst thou mark the hinds, when the hinds do calf? So he's saying all this stuff is happening in nature, and you've got no clue how any of it functions. And I designed it all. And it works. It all works perfectly. Because I am God. And I know what I'm talking about. And you don't. Chapter 42. There's kind of a dialogue here at the end. So follow along here. He goes back and forth a little bit. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. God speaks. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Job says, therefore have I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful for me which I knew not. God speaks. Hear, I beseech thee, and I will speak. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. Verse 5 is Job. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. Wherefore I abhor myself, and repent in dust and ashes. In a way, as you're reading through Job, you come to this whirlwind and you're expecting, okay, we're getting there. We're getting there. God's putting him in his place, and then he's going to just, boom, he's going to lay it all out. Here's why. Here's why, Job. You don't understand it, but I do. Here's why I allow the suffering of the godly. But that explanation never comes. In a way, it could almost feel a little bit disappointing. The book ends never answering the question, why do the godly suffer? Now, the answer in Job's case, we know from the very beginning. The very beginning of the story, there was this meeting between God and his angels, and Satan comes up, and there is this spiritual warfare that happens where God allows Satan to touch Job in order to prove that his servant is upright. And all of this stuff is going on in heavenly realms that Job could never comprehend if he tried. We can't even comprehend it. But that's why Job was suffering, because of this war between God and Satan. And God could have explained that to him. But by explaining to him, he would have removed the very reason for which he allowed him to suffer. And that was just to learn to trust him. Because Satan challenged God and said, you take all this away, you put him through affliction, he'll curse you. He'll stop trusting you. If God were just to reveal it all, it would have tainted the experiment, the test. He wanted to prove his servant Job. And so he said nothing. He never told him about that exchange. He never told him how the story ends. We know how the story ends. So that makes it easy for us. Like, oh, it's a happy ending and everything. When Job was going through it, he didn't see any of that. He had to learn to trust God with or without an explanation. Just to trust that God is way more powerful than I understand. And God is way more wise than I can ever comprehend. I think I understand justice in the world, but I don't. I don't have knowledge that God has. His ways are so much higher than my ways. His thoughts are so much higher than my thoughts. There were forces at work that Job couldn't have comprehended, and Elihu in some ways was right, that God does not owe us an explanation. It should be enough to know that He sees our pain, which God did. God saw what Job was going through. God knew every bit of what was happening to Job, and He cared enough to speak to him. Isn't that amazing? And don't you love it when God speaks to you when you need it most? He speaks to you maybe not out of the whirlwind, but out of the Word. And you're going through something and you're suffering and you're asking for an answer. And in some ways, He speaks to you, even though He may not answer the way that you want Him to. He speaks. He cares. He knows. You know, in the heat of the debate, in this exasperation with everybody ganging up on him, Job did sin at times. And there were times in the discussion where he charged God as unjust and unfair. But ultimately, I believe that Job passed the test. Keep your place in chapter 42, but look at Job 13. It's kind of in the middle of the book that Job makes some statements that really show that he was getting it, that he understood. Job chapter 13 and verse 15. What an incredible statement here. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. But I will maintain mine own ways before him. You know what? I may never get an answer to this. And it may take me to my grave. And even if God kills me, I still have to trust Him. Because I know who He is. I know He loves me. I know He sees me. I know that He has some higher purpose for all of this. Even if I'm not allowed to see what it is, if He slay me, yet I will trust Him. And then, back in chapter 42, God is angry with the three friends. We're just about done. Don't tune out just yet. But God's angry with the friends because they had claimed to be speaking for God, giving Him counsel, saying, this is how God is, and they totally misrepresented who God was. They did not say the right thing. And look at verse 7. And it was so that after the Lord had spoken these words unto Job, the Lord said unto Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against thee, and against thy two friends, for ye have not spoken of me the thing that is right, as my servant Job hath. So who was right? The one who said, you're a sinner, Job, or the one who was saying, this is not a result of my sin? Job was right. This was not a punishment for sin. Job spoke rightly. You did not. And so, and I believe he's angry because of, in their debating with Job, they brought him to the brink of discouragement and despair. You know, when Satan attacked Job, it says, in all this, Job sinned not. In all this, Job sinned not with his lips. But when his friends came, he ended up sinning with his lips. He ended up saying things that were beyond the line. His friends pushed him further than the direct attack of Satan had pushed him. That's how bad counsel is. When you say something to somebody, especially somebody who is suffering, who is going through something, you'd better watch your tongue. And it's hard. When we're dealing with somebody who is suffering, It's hard to know what to say. It's hard to find some reasons. But I guarantee you, it's better to say nothing at all than to give them something that misrepresents the character of God and drives them to despair. God will hold us accountable for every word. He says even every idle word. And certainly every word that we say that is representing His sense of justice and what He is doing. Tell you what, when people are going through something and I don't understand why, I'm not going to sit here and say, well, maybe this is why, maybe this is why. Did you ever do this? Did you ever do that? Did you ever do such and such? This has probably happened to you because this and this and this and this and this. That is not my job. My job is to give them Scripture, share with them from the Word of God some encouraging passages, and to teach them from books like the book of Job that says, you know what? It's okay to ask why, but just know you may not get an answer. And be okay with that. To continue to trust God even if He never gives you an explanation. That His ways are so much higher. And in the end, when we see it all play out, and Job in the end, everything's restored to him. You know, he has more children, his wife comes back, his riches come back, double of what he had before, his friends come back, his whole life is restored and put back together. And in the end, no doubt he could look back and say, it was for a purpose. But we may not get that in this lifetime. Our restoration, our happy ending may not happen on this earth. It may happen in heaven one day. I guess I lack the words to explain why we suffer sometimes. A whole book of the Bible dedicated to the question kind of leaves us without a definite answer. Don't be disappointed by that. Just run back to God and say, I know you're powerful. I know you're good. I know you love me. And for this time in this life, that has to be enough. I'm just going to trust you. Though you slay me, yet will I trust you. That's Job and what we can learn from the school of suffering. Let's pray. Father,